is to teach, not to punish. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand why traditional disciplinary practices in schools are ineffective, understand the science of behavior and motivation of behavior, and understand and implement restorative practices. Currently, the behavior system in some of our schools are designed for students to be sent somewhere in isolation when they misbehave, with no restoration or teaching, which is the result of setting our students up for yet another negative system. Let's look at a case study. Charlie has been going to Blue Elementary School for 3 years. He has been suspended at least once a year at his school. His teachers have expressed his disrespectful attitude, his lack of motivation to complete his work, and constantly out of his seat. This has caused Charlie to become isolated and removed from his class on multiple occasions. And now he has developed the label as the bad kid from his teachers and his peers. Fast forward to high school. Charlie has been sent to the office every time he has been in trouble. No one has ever taken the time to clarify their role with Charlie, establish a safe relationship with him, or create an environment of respect and safety. Unfortunately, he has fallen through the cracks. Charlie makes okay grades, but he has never been identified as a student that needs extra academic supports. His attendance is pretty poor, and his behavior of disrespect and lack of motivation continues, which leads him to suspension and eventually dropping out and never graduating high school. Fast forward to 5 years, Charlie finds himself in jail. Unfortunately, this graphic shows the consequences of the current behavioral systems we have in our schools. When we discipline to punish and not to teach, our students end up in the systems that don't teach the appropriate lagging skills, and guess who is there to catch them when they fail? Gangs, welfare, and judicial systems. When we shift our perspective from retribution to restoration, it changes how policies are developed and implemented in schools when encountering traumatized students, and it has a ripple effect across the school environment and culture. So let's talk about Charlie and his behavior. When we reframe how we think about behavior, we can restore his behavior rather than punish his behavior. What is retribution? Retribution is when we are blaming someone else. We think they deserve punishment, so these are the strategies we use: isolation, detention, humiliation, yelling. What is that doing? Is that teaching Charlie anything? No. We can restore his behavior by asking him what is happening in his life, finding out what is going on, and allowing him to take responsibility for his behavior by understanding how his actions have affected others. Let's discuss the science of behavior, and let's dive into why behavior happens. It is hard to teach and very frustrating when a student disrupts your classroom instruction. It is easier to use punitive strategies when bad behavior happens. Science of behavior. What we saw with the case study of Charlie, if we do that over and over again, that only impacts his life in a negative light. So let's look at the science of behavior. Let's learn to understand why Charlie is engaging in some of those behaviors. Behavior is predictable. We can predict the behavior if we know these 3 things, the ABCs. The A stands for antecedent. This tells us what happens immediately before the behavior, which is setting the stage for you to determine the behavior. Science of behavior tells us that a trigger or a thing that happens right before behavior contributes to problem behavior. Also, with an antecedent, there is a slow trigger and a fast trigger. A slow trigger is something that makes it more likely the behavior will happen. A fast trigger is something that triggers the behavior or something that sets off the student. Moving on to B. B stands for behavior. This happens for a purpose. It has a reason. When a child misbehaves, they are trying to communicate something to you. Finally, we have C, consequence. The resulting event or outcomes that occurs immediately following the behavior. Consequence is what happens right after the behavior, and the science of behavior tells us that this maintains problem behavior. Whatever you do after behavior is going to either increase the likelihood that it'll happen again, which is called reinforcement, or it will either decrease what will happen again, and we refer this to punishment, but not in the sense of discipline. So really, it's a math equation, plus or minus. So back to Charlie. Let's say that he flipped over his desk. Thinking of the science of behavior, we want to know why this is happening. The objective is to use restorative practices to restore his behavior to appropriate behavior. If we think about how behavior happens in a series of events, let's say right before that, the teacher asked him to turn in his math homework. He then flips over the desk and the teacher sends him to the office. Let's discuss why he might have done that. What was the series of events? Antecedent, teacher asked Charlie to turn in the math homework. Behavior, he flipped over the desk. Consequence, he gets sent to the office. So now let's talk about why Charlie might have flipped over that desk, his motive. We know that this behavior never happens in isolation. It's a series of events. The problem behavior was Charlie flipped over the desk. The science of behavior tells us that there are two reasons Charlie might have engaged in that bad behavior. He might have obtained or to get something, or escape and avoid something. That could be avoiding a task, activity, peer attention, or adult attention. Charlie flips over the desk and he gets sent to the office. Let's say that happens every day for 3 weeks. Anytime the teacher asks him to turn in an assignment, he flips over a desk. What do you think is motivating this behavior? Correct. Avoiding turning in homework and avoiding the request of his teacher. The consequence in this scenario either increases or decreases the likelihood of the behavior happening again. If every time that he is being sent to the office for engaging in bad behavior, we can assume that Charlie's motive of behavior is to get out of something. So, as educators, are we reinforcing the behavior or punishing the behavior? We think we're punishing, but the science of behavior says we are reinforcing the bad behavior because it is a series and a pattern. In essence, we have taught Charlie a negative pattern of behavior. Perspective shift. By shifting our perspective, having students' behaviors and school discipline approaches, we can move towards more restorative practices when disciplining to teach our students. However, it does challenge what we have learned about students' behaviors and school discipline approaches. The purpose of shifting our perspective when it comes to disciplining to teach and reinforcing appropriate behavior. By teaching our students the appropriate lagging and emotional regulation skills such as accepting and adjusting to changes in school settings, following instructions and making decisions, and requesting a break as opposed to just sending them out to the office. With these techniques, we are equipping our students to help prevent those fast triggers. Restorative practices. Research tells us that our children are experiencing high amounts of adverse experiences. Children aren't just being bad for the sake of being bad. The most effective way to increase the appropriate behavior is to teach it. The idea is that the consequence that we want to apply is focused on and teaching what we want to see rather than focusing on the negative behavior. Being trauma-informed is a shift in your perspective as you learned in Module 1. Shifting that perspective includes being able to implement alternatives to suspension in order to keep those students in school and correcting the desired behavior. Here is a list of trauma-informed restorative practices you can implement in your classroom today. We should always be doing our best to use practices that will allow our students to be successful as possible. Building relationships and meeting the needs of kids is the core of what we do and is the core of what we should do every day. With that being said, there is no greater intervention than a student having a safe relationship.
Restorative practices is a tool used to build relationships between teachers and students to students. There's 4 different proactive approaches that we use with restorative practices, but the biggest one we're focusing on today is circles. Circles give students an opportunity to speak their voice and have their voices heard.
I gotta say, happiness is probably acceptance of everything that has been brought into my life. Even the small bumps in the road, but I stayed happy throughout that. I didn't let any of those defeat me. I kind of went on and just kind of got to the next goal.
Speaking positivity into her life, connecting teachers and students and principals. I think that every student at Mesquite ISD deserves the opportunity to experience restorative practices.
Our first circle, there was a lot of guidance. Our class didn't know each other as well. Not much friends. By the 3rd or 4th circle, everyone began to really share their experience, influence one another every time they come into class, talk about things they usually wouldn't talk about. And ever since, the class bond is changed. Everyone feels like family.
If it wasn't for the circle, I wouldn't know what was really going on with my kids. And it would almost be that superficial relationship. I've always been a teacher that had good relationships with my kids, but when I started circling with my kids, that's when I truly saw them for who they really were. And the best part is they started to see me, who I really was.
And once that they see that from you, they see that you're human, that you've made mistakes, that you've been in their shoes, they are 100% more likely to listen to you and to want to learn and to want to talk to you, to where before if you're just a brick wall and just come in, do your work, sit down and leave and don't build that relationship, they're not going to care much about you and not remember anything you've ever taught them.
When you say you want more people to build relationships with each other and you want your school to be safe and for people to feel really connected, when you come to Circle, you really learn about people's struggles and the things that other kids are going through, and that helps them connect through their situations, and that's what creates and makes a better school. So that's why you need to be doing Circle.
We had a Circle not too long ago, and it was a close-knit group. One of the young ladies wasn't sharing a whole lot, and a question came out, and she talked about how she had just lost her grandmother the night before. And immediately another girl ran up to her and gave her the biggest hug and said, I just lost mine 2 days ago. And these connections, you see these kids, all of a sudden, they realize that they're not alone with their problems. Kids experience depression and they think that they're alone, and another kid says, I'm experiencing depression too. And I think when you realize you're not alone, that's when healing starts. True healing begins.
Circle has made me think about things like what other people are going through, and I feel like everybody's going through something, and that's why they act the way they do.
Well, I had a class who was arguing a lot. They have big personalities in there, and after we came to Circle, they started realizing that they needed to take responsibility for their own selves and started apologizing to each other outside of class. I've had some, can I go speak to Mr. Overton and our student success? I need a minute.
I was really upset because everything's going on in my life and no one was there to talk to me or help me get out of all the sad phases in my life.
When someone says something to purposely make me mad, I used to just lash out and say bad things to them and do all that stuff. Now I'm just like, okay, maybe, they're probably feeling a certain way. Let me see what's going on. Let me see how they're feeling. And I actually talk to them and see what's on their mind.
And it really helps me get through the day better in my lessons because we understand each other a little bit better. So I think every teacher, especially new teachers, should be involved in it.
If we look at the term circle itself, it's ever continuing. There's no end.
Mm-hmm.
Circle is important for educators, not just at Warren High School, but
we're changing mindsets and we're changing culture, not just within our students, but in our teachers as well. Some of those ones that are out for a punishment, they're now looking for accountability.
If I had it my way, I would love to see every elementary school, every middle school, and every high school in the district circling, building those relationships, building community inside those classrooms. It's so pivotal. It's a chance for growth, a chance for change. We talk about change all the time. How are we going to create and make better young men and young women for the future? Folks, to me, this is the answer.
This high school is implementing restorative circles. This is a great way to teach, model, and prompt. These circles allow students an opportunity to speak their voices and have their voices be heard. There are so many examples of restorative practices. Here are some resources you can research yourself that best fit your style, your classroom, and your preference. In conclusion, why is this important? When we understand the behavior as a series of events, the ABCs, and then understanding what you do and how you respond after the student's behavior is crucial. When disciplining, you can teach children effective strategies to be more successful. We can teach them how to get what they need through trauma-informed restorative practices by clarifying your role with the student, establishing yourself as a safe individual, creating those environments of respect, and talking about safety and what steps you will take to help the student feel safe,